Drive through the older streets of Chattanooga and you will pass them without knowing what they are. Wide porches, deep lawns, iron gates that have outlived the families who paid for them. The same houses stand in Charlotte. They stand in Greenville. They stand in a great many American towns where nobody would expect to find that kind of money. All of them went up inside the same 40 years, built by people doing the same thing. They bottled a soft drink. Every one of those houses traces back to a single afternoon in Atlanta in the summer of 1899. That day, a man signed away the right to put Coca-Cola in a bottle across most of the United States. He did it because he thought the idea was worthless. The price of the paper was $1. I have looked at houses like these for a long time, and I had the story backwards. I assumed the money came from the drink. It did not. The money came from the wording. The document that was signed that afternoon had 2 flaws in it that nobody put there on purpose. It never expired. And it fixed the price forever. For 87 years, the company that signed it tried to get it back. $1, 600 words. The room was in Atlanta, and the month was July. In Georgia, that means the 2 men who had traveled down from Chattanooga arrived already tired of the argument ahead of them. They had been having it for weeks. Benjamin Franklin Thomas was 38. Joseph Brown Whitehead was 35. Both were attorneys. Both were looking for something better than law, and both had fixed on the same peculiar idea. Thomas had served in Cuba during the war with Spain. He had watched soldiers buy carbonated fruit drinks by the bottle, quickly and in quantity, and the speed of it had stayed with him. Back in Tennessee, he found a partner who would listen. The man they had come to see was Asa Candler, who had bought a struggling Atlanta syrup business years earlier and turned it into something that actually made money. He sold his product to druggists. Druggists mixed it at the counter and served it cold in a glass. That was the entire business. And as far as Candler could see, that was the only business there was ever going to be. Bottling struck him as a way to ruin it. Carbonation was unreliable. Seals leaked. A bottle that sat too long in a hot store would sour, and the person who drank it would not blame the bottler. They would blame the name printed on the label. So he said no, and the 2 lawyers kept asking. And on the 21st of July, he stopped saying no. The document they signed was short. Accounts of it describe something close to 600 words, which is roughly the length of a long letter. It granted them the right to bottle and sell the drink across most of the country. Mississippi was carved out because a candy merchant in Vicksburg had already been bottling it for 5 years, and Candler saw no reason to disturb him. Some accounts hold that Texas and the New England states were left out as well, and added later. The sources do not entirely agree, and it matters less than what was left in. Nothing in the paper said when it ended. Nothing in it allowed the price of the syrup to move. The consideration written into the contract was $1. There is a story, repeated almost everywhere the contract is mentioned, that Candler never troubled to collect it. At least one historical marker that tells the story calls it possibly apocryphal, and that is the honest position. What is documented is the figure. Whether a coin ever changed hands is folklore, and folklore is what the last 100 years have preferred. What surprised me, reading around this, is that Candler was not being careless. He was being consistent. He had built everything on the counter and the glass, and he was giving away a thing he did not believe existed. The 2 men went home with the paper and discovered the immediate problem. One bottling plant cost roughly $7,500 to equip, something near $300,000 in today's money. And between them, they did not have it. They were turned down by the first people they approached. Then they went to a 3rd Chattanooga attorney named John Thomas Lupton. He had married into a patent medicine fortune and understood exactly what a cheap product sold 1,000,000 times over could do. Lupton put up the money. Whitehead sold him half his interest to get it. In September, the first plant opened at 17 Market Street in Chattanooga. In November, the company was chartered in Tennessee. Whitehead was named president, Lupton vice president, Thomas secretary and treasurer, and the world's first Coca-Cola bottling business began filling glass with a foot-powered machine. Candler had done what he intended. He had protected the counter-trade, offloaded a risk he did not want, and kept his syrup contract with two men he considered harmless. He is finished in this story. He would sell his company 2 decades later for $25 million. He is remembered for that sale and for the buildings he put up in Atlanta. Almost every account of his life treats the afternoon in July as a footnote or a joke. The men who walked out with the paper did not treat it as either. Within 8 months, they had fallen out with each other so badly that they divided the United States between them rather than keep working in the same room. The house on the bluff. Limestone, 90 feet of it dropping straight to the Tennessee River on the eastern edge of Chattanooga. It is a difficult place to build and an obvious place to want to. The bluff itself has a longer history than the house. Confederate troops used the high ground during the war, for the obvious reason that anyone standing there can see a very long way up and down the water. Nothing was built on it afterwards for 40 years. In 1904, a well-off insurance broker named Ross Faxon decided to want it. He hired a firm from Cincinnati and got, as his architect, a 36-year-old named Abram Garfield. Garfield is worth a sentence of his own. He was the youngest son of President James Garfield, and he was 9 years old when his father died in office. He was raised in Washington, took a degree at Williams, studied architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, traveled in Europe, and came home to Cleveland to practice. The house on the bluff is one of the larger things he built before his partnership dissolved. What he designed was a house with 2 different faces, and neither of them is original to him. The side that looks at the river is a version of the porch at Mount Vernon, stretched out along 8 2-story Corinthian columns. The side that looks at the city is a semicircular portico, 2 stories again, that recalls the south front of the White House. A man in Chattanooga in 1904 was being handed a house that quoted the 2 best-known dwellings in the country. Both quotations sat on the same building, at right angles to each other. I find the riverfront the stranger of the 2. Mount Vernon faces the Potomac because Washington wanted to look at his own landing. Here the same porch faces a working river with railway on the far bank, and it reads less like a quotation than a wish. The Faxons lived in it for about a decade. Then they went to California to manage land they owned there, and the house passed through several owners without settling. 1920 is when it becomes part of this story. The buyer was Ann Taylor Thomas. Her husband Benjamin, the taller of the 2 lawyers in the Atlanta room, had died 6 years earlier at 54. They had no children. What they had done instead, back in 1904, was send to Maysville in Kentucky for their nephew. George Thomas Hunter was 18 when he arrived. He was put to work as a clerk in the bottling business, sent to school in Chattanooga, and told without much ceremony that he was the heir. He became secretary of the company in 1906 and took control of it when his uncle died. So the house on the bluff was bought with bottling money by a widow. She lived in it with her nephew for 18 years. Ann Thomas died in 1938. Hunter inherited the house, the business, and the fortune. He never married. He bought art steadily and seriously, and hung it in the rooms Garfield had designed for a family that never came back from California. When he died around 1950, he left the bulk of everything he owned to a charitable trust he had set up 6 years earlier. The next part is the reason you can still see the building. An arts association in Chattanooga went to the trustees and asked for the house, not to preserve it, to use it. They wanted the city's first permanent art museum, and they had no building. The trustees agreed, and in July of 1952, the rooms opened to the public. The collection he assembled is the reason the request came to the trustees at all. Hunter had been buying American painting for years, quietly, and the pictures were already in the house. A city with no museum suddenly had both the pictures and the walls to hang them on, held by the same estate. They named the new institution after him. It was listed on the National Register in 1980. A walking bridge now connects the grounds to the old road bridge over the river. The house that was built to be looked at from below is reached on foot from above. A wing went up in 1975 in raw concrete, which was the fashion and which nobody has ever claimed improves the view. Another went up around 2005. The original block was restored in the late 1990s. The woodwork, the light fittings, and the carved fruit and leaf ornament in the plaster are the ones installed for the insurance broker. Of the 4 large houses in this documentary, 3 are gone, altered beyond recognition or in private hands. This one has a gift shop and opens at 10. A map on a desk in April. They could not agree about time. Not about money, which is what you would expect from 2 lawyers 8 months into a business, and not about who was in charge. About how long a local bottler should be allowed to keep what he was given. Thomas wanted 2 years. Give a man a town, watch what he does with it, and if he sells badly or dilutes the syrup or lets the plant go dirty, decline to renew. 2 years keeps a man attentive. Whitehead wanted forever. Give him the town outright, with no end date, exactly as Candler had given it to them. A man who owns a thing improves it. A man who rents it does the minimum. Both positions are defensible, and both men were lawyers, which meant neither was going to lose the argument. So they did something stranger than compromise. Early in 1900, Whitehead had already moved to Atlanta and opened a second plant on Edgewood Avenue. That April, with Candler's corporation consenting, the two of them divided the United States and stopped working together. Thomas kept the eastern half from Chattanooga north, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Middle Atlantic states, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee. Then, because he thought the coast had room to grow, he also took California, Oregon, and Washington. Whitehead took the south below Chattanooga and most of the west, which is where soft drinks actually sold in 1900, and brought Lupton in beside him. Texas came to them 2 years later. There is a detail here that reads like a clerical error and was not one. Thomas called his company the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. Whitehead and Lupton first called theirs the Dixie Coca-Cola Bottling Company, then changed it to the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. The difference between the two firms in writing was the word "the." For the next 20 years, American courts and American bankers dealt with 2 separate corporations that carried almost the same name, sold the same syrup, and operated under opposite rules. More parent companies followed as the map filled in. One took Texas and Oklahoma in 1903. Another took the Far West in 1905. The New England states went to a man named Monroe Bickart in 1916, which is how late that corner of the country came to the drink. One more clause deserves mentioning, because it is the only place in the arrangement where anybody thought about the customer. The paper specified the mixture, no less than 1 ounce of syrup to 8 ounces of water. A bottler in a small town could cut corners on his building, his wagons, and his labor. The strength of what he sold was fixed in a document signed before he was in business. Here is the part that takes a moment to see, and it took me longer than it should have. Neither company bottled anything. The businesses these men now owned did not fill a single bottle after the first 2 plants. They bought syrup from Atlanta at the fixed price in the 1899 paper. Then they sold it onward to local men. Those men put up their own buildings, bought their own machines, hired their own wagons and drivers, and carried the entire risk in their own towns. The 2 Chattanooga companies took a margin on every gallon that moved through them, a few cents. By the middle of the century, that margin was around 12.5 cents a gallon, and by then it was moving through more than 1,000 plants. They were not manufacturers, they were landlords of a map, and because they had split rather than settle, the map had 2 different sets of rules on it. If you were a druggist in Ohio or a mill supplier in Virginia, you dealt with Thomas, and what you got was 2 years. Renewable, usually renewed, but 2 years. Your grandchildren inherited a business that could be taken away. If you were the same man in Alabama or Louisiana or Texas, you dealt with Whitehead and Lupton, and what you got had no expiry printed on it anywhere. Your grandchildren inherited a right, the same drink, the same year, the same original sheet of paper. 2 entirely different kinds of American family came out the other side of it. The difference was decided in April of 1900 by 2 men who could not talk each other round. The year the sugar broke. Sugar cost about 9 cents a pound in the spring of 1920. By the end of that year, it was worth a fraction of that, and the collapse in between is the reason this documentary has a second half. The Atlanta company had changed hands the year before. A syndicate of investors had bought it from the Candler family the year before and taken it public. The men now running it were looking hard at the books they had inherited. What they found in those books was the paper from 1899. The syrup price in that contract did not move. It had been set when sugar was cheap and stayed set when sugar was not. Every gallon the company sold to the two Chattanooga firms went out at a figure fixed in a room 21 years earlier. By the spring of 1920, the company was losing money on each one. So it did the thing any board would do. It tried to change the price. The bottlers refused to negotiate until they were shown the actual cost of manufacturing the syrup. The company declined to show them. That stalemate went into court, and in June, the two sides accepted an interim arrangement. Syrup would be sold at $1.72 a gallon, something close to $27 today. If no final decision had come by the 1st of November, the price would rise or fall with the company's real manufacturing costs. The bottlers agreed to that because of what they had been told about sugar. An affidavit filed that June by the chairman of the company gave them to understand that its long-term sugar contracts were priced well below the market. If sugar was cheap in the company's warehouses, then costs would fall, and November would bring relief. The company had in fact bought heavily near the top of the market. Reading the record, I kept expecting to find a moment where somebody realized what was about to happen and said so. It is not there. The sugar price kept falling through the autumn. The bottlers waited for the 1st of November and the reduction they had been promised by the arithmetic. In November, the company raised the price instead to recover the cost of the expensive sugar sitting in its warehouses. It raised it again in December. It raised it again in January. By agreeing to a price built on the company's own costs, the bottlers had taken the market risk onto themselves and taken it off the company entirely. One of them wrote to the chairman the following January setting out in some detail what he believed he had been told and what had actually occurred. That is the ordinary commercial half of the story, and it is not the half that mattered. The company had also argued something larger. It argued that the 1899 contract could be ended at will. There was no term in it, no expiry, no renewal clause. The company's position was that a contract without an end could be closed by either side whenever it chose. The bottlers said the opposite. No end date meant no end. On the 8th of November 1920, a federal court in Delaware granted the bottlers an injunction stopping the company from canceling. The contracts were perpetual, and the parent bottlers did not merely hold a license they could lose. They held property rights in the business of bottling the drink. Read that back slowly because a great deal follows from it. A company that had sold something for $1 had just been told by a federal judge that it could not buy the thing back. It could not cancel. It could not raise the price without agreement. The thing it had given away in an afternoon was now an asset owned by other people, protected in law, with no expiry. The parties settled in 1921 by consent decree. The price was reworked so that it moved with the sugar market rather than sitting frozen, which suited everybody. The contracts stayed perpetual, which suited one side considerably more than the other. The men who built the houses in this documentary now had something better than a good business. They had a right that could be inherited, borrowed against, and sold, and the largest beverage company in the country was legally required to keep supplying them. Every mansion in the chapters that follow was paid for out of that November ruling. Chapter 5, 30 Acres in Riverview. 30 acres bounded by 5 roads. That is the footprint John Thomas Lupton bought on the north side of the Tennessee River, in a Chattanooga neighborhood called Riverview. The size is the first thing to understand about the house he put in the middle of it. 30 acres inside a city is not a garden. It is a small estate that happens to have streets on all 4 sides. Lupton had 2 fortunes, and only one of them came from the drink. In November of 1889, he had married Elizabeth Patton, the only daughter of Zeboim Carter Patton, who had founded the Chattanooga Medicine Company a decade earlier. That business sold patent remedies in an era before the federal government took much interest in whether they worked. Two of its products carried the household names, one a tonic marketed to women, and the other a laxative sold across the South. Lupton went to work for his father-in-law as counsel, then as vice president and treasurer. He learned there what a cheap article sold to millions of ordinary people would do to a balance sheet. He learned it several years before two colleagues came asking for money to bottle a drink. There is a footnote to that medicine business worth keeping. For a period, the Chattanooga Medicine Company was headed by a local newspaper publisher named Adolph Oakes, who was very likely an investor as well. Oakes went on to buy a struggling paper in New York called The Times and turn it into the most quoted newspaper in the country. Two of the largest American fortunes of the next century were sitting in the same small Tennessee boardroom, and neither had been made yet. Lupton was also, by every account, not entirely convinced the drink would last. The story told in Chattanooga is that Lupton worried sugar water might turn out to be a passing enthusiasm, and hedged accordingly. He put money into a textile business and into a life insurance company. Both were local and solid, the sort of investment a man makes when he suspects his best asset might evaporate. It did not evaporate. By 1910, he was building. The house was called Lindhurst, reportedly after an English village the family had enjoyed visiting. The figure usually given for it is around 34,000 square feet. Contemporary descriptions list 10 bedrooms and 12 bathrooms, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley in the basement, and a pipe organ. Chattanooga said at the time that only Biltmore in North Carolina beat it. That is local pride rather than measurement, and it should be treated as such, but it tells you what people in the city believed they were looking at. I could find only 2 or 3 photographs of it that are readily available anywhere. For a house of that scale, in a city that size, built by a man that rich, the visual record is almost nothing. A couple of aerials, a frontal view or two. The interiors that are described in every account of the place, the organ and the pool and the long paneled rooms, exist now only as sentences. That absence is worth sitting with for a moment. Biltmore has been photographed several million times. Lindhurst was larger than most of the Newport cottages, and it is effectively invisible. Part of the reason is the man himself. Lupton did not court attention. He gave money to the city steadily and without ceremony, and he did something else that shaped the entire industry. He handed out territories to people he knew, friends, relatives, men he had met through the medicine business or through his wife's family. He gave them towns, and the towns made them rich, and a considerable number of American fortunes that look self-made trace back to a conversation with Lupton in Chattanooga. His own son later inherited what the arrangement had built. He died in 1933 of a ruptured appendix at 71. The house passed to his widow. She stayed in it for 8 more years, and after that nobody lived in it at all. His son Carter was an only child. He was 34 when his father died, and he took over the bottling interests at once. The name Lindhurst has outlasted the building by a considerable margin, and it now belongs to something else entirely. What happened in between is the ugliest sequence in this documentary, and it did not happen quickly. A farm boy sells his horse. The letter arrived on a farm in Clark County, Virginia, in 1901. The young man who opened it was working his father's land and engaged to a woman named Alfreda Chrisman, who was related to John Thomas Lupton. That connection is the whole reason the letter existed. Lupton had been writing to him about the bottling business, and the letters had been persuasive without being extravagant. One line in that correspondence stayed with me because of how modest it is. Lupton told him he might not make big money in this business, but he would at the very least make a good living. That is the sales pitch, not a fortune, a living. Luther Snyder saved what he could, sold his horse, left the farm, and went to Atlanta to learn the trade under Whitehead. He was 28. In April of 1902, he was sent to Charlotte, North Carolina, to open the first bottling plant in either of the Carolinas. Charlotte at that moment had about 17,000 people, 18 saloons, and 2 breweries. And Snyder said years afterwards that selling soft drinks against that competition was miserable work. 2 things saved him, and neither was his own doing. The first was temperance. The movement was moving through the South town by town, and it closed the saloons and the breweries ahead of national prohibition. Men who had drunk something else at the end of a shift now needed something to drink. The second was cotton. Charlotte was turning into a textile center. Mill hands working long hours in that heat were exactly the customers this product had been waiting for. The operation Snyder ran in those first years would look absurd now. The capping machinery was worked by foot. One man could fill and cap about 4 bottles a minute, roughly 10 cases in an hour. Each horse-drawn wagon carried 10 cases into town and came back for more. From that, over 3 decades came the following. Snyder opened plants in Albemarle, Concord, Gastonia, Lexington, Lincolnton, Monroe, Salisbury, Shelby, and Statesville. 9 more North Carolina towns, each with its own building, its own wagons, its own employees, and its own local money. That is the mechanism working exactly as designed. One man from a Virginia farm was handed a territory by someone he had never worked for. He seeded 10 towns with businesses that would support families in each of them for generations. Multiply that by the hundreds of men who got the same letter from somebody. Snyder moved his Charlotte plant 3 times between 1907 and 1920 as it outgrew each building. In 1930, he spent $100,000 on a new headquarters on Moorhead Street, close to $2 million today. The script name was carved above the door, and stone bottles stood at the corners. Large windows let people on the pavement watch the bottling. His own house had gone up 10 years before that, on Queens Road in Myers Park. Myers Park was the planned suburb wealthy Charlotte was moving into. Snyder built a Georgian house there, designed by Martin Boyer. The grounds were laid out by Earl Sumner Draper, the landscape architect who shaped a great deal of the residential South. It was described at the time as finer than the houses around it, which in that neighborhood took some doing. It later became a dormitory for the college across the road. The same pattern turned up wherever the territories went. In Greenville, South Carolina, the bottling company was founded by a man named Charles Ellis. He died in 1918, and his widow Stella took over the direction of the business. That is not the sort of thing that was supposed to happen in South Carolina in that year. It happened anyway. The plant her company built in 1930 stood on 4 wooded acres on Buncombe Street. It used water piped from Paris Mountain. It had a heavy bracketed cornice, decorative downspouts, and ornamental lampposts, which is a considerable amount of architecture for a building whose job was filling bottles. Part of it is still standing. It holds a museum now. 9 towns from one man in one state. Then the same story again in the next state, and the one after that, and the one after that. Somebody in Atlanta was keeping count. The woman who counted them all worked out of Atlanta, and she had not asked for the job. The widow who kept the territory. He went to Virginia to rest and did not come back. Joseph Whitehead had been traveling for years by then, across the South and the Midwest. He sold territories and arranged transport for a product that had to reach small towns in glass. It is exhausting work, and he had been doing it since 1900. He had a cold he could not shake, and he was tired in the way that alarms a family. So they went to Thaxton in Bedford County, where his wife had grown up. The cold became pneumonia. He died on the 27th of August, 1906, at 42. He left no will. Under Georgia law, the estate divided between his widow and his 2 sons, aged 11 and 8. The widow was 34 years old, had been married for 12 years, and had no formal training in business of any kind. I had assumed before looking properly that the machinery around her would have taken over. A board of trustees, a male executor, a family friend appointed to manage things for the poor woman until the boys came of age. That is the standard shape of this story in 1906, and it is what I expected to find. It is not what happened. Letty Pate Whitehead took the chair of the Whitehead Holding Company and the presidency of the Whitehead Realty Company. From that position, she ran her late husband's share of the bottling business for the next 28 years. The numbers are the argument. When her husband died, there were about 80 bottling plants operating in the country. By 1909, 3 years later, there were close to 400, most of them family-owned, some of them open only in the hot months. Within 2 decades of the original contract, there were more than 1,000, and roughly 95 in every 100 were locally owned and run. That growth is the reason every house in this documentary exists, and a substantial portion of it happened in her territory, under her direction, while she was raising 2 boys. She did not do it alone and never claimed to. What she did was choose the men who ran the operations and keep choosing well, which is the entire job of anyone at the top of a business that size. In December of 1913, she married again. Arthur Kelly Evans was a civil engineer and a retired Canadian Army officer. The couple had intended to marry in New York. He fell ill on the journey north from Atlanta and was treated in a hospital in Lynchburg, and they married there instead. Her houses now become the interesting part. She had lived at 583 Peachtree Street in Atlanta since 1903, when the business first made enough for the family to leave a boarding house. After the second marriage, she moved her life north into the Virginia mountains. In 1918, she bought a house in Hot Springs from the man who had built it. In 1927, she bought a much larger one on the hill above the village. Barton Lodge had been put up between 1898 and 1900 for an investor in the local springs company. It is neoclassical revival, 5 bays wide, with a pedimented portico carried on Corinthian columns, and it sits on French's Hill looking down on the resort hotel. It was built on a steel frame, which in that valley at that date was close to experimental. She renamed it Malvern Hall. She added 2 wings at the back, moved the kitchen and the laundry, and altered the ceilings and the bathrooms. She lived in it for the rest of her life. She entertained the president of the Atlanta Company and his wife there, and traveled to England regularly until the war stopped it. In 1934, 2 things happened together. The Whitehead family sold the bottling company back to Atlanta in exchange for common stock, and she was appointed to the board of directors of that company, among the first women to sit on the board of any major American corporation. She held the seat for nearly 20 years. Then the negative space. Her elder son died in 1935 at 40. Her younger son died in November 1940 at 42, the same age his father had been. Her second husband died in 1948. She died in Hot Springs on the 14th of November 1953 at 81, having outlived 2 husbands and both children. Every one of them left their money to the same place, and it was not to each other. 87 years to undo it. They were paid in shares. That is the detail to hold on to about how the Atlanta Company began recovering what it had sold. It explains why the families in this documentary stayed rich long after they stopped bottling anything. By the middle of the 1930s, both the Whitehead interests and Lupton had agreed to sell their rights back to the company. They did not take cash, they took common stock in the Coca-Cola Company. Instead of taking cents on each gallon that moved, they now owned a piece of the business that made the syrup. The South went first in 1934. The West followed in 1935. The Southwest, including Texas, went in 1940. The amounts paid for those 3 transactions are not publicly recorded in any form I could verify. That cleared the map on one side. The other side took considerably longer. The Thomas Company, the one that had insisted on 2-year contracts back in 1900, stayed in family hands for another generation and a half. It was finally repurchased in 1974 for $35 million, which is somewhere near $230 million in today's money, 75 years after a $1 signature. That is transaction number 1 of the 2 that closed this out. The last piece was the Lupton holding, and it had grown into something the men in the Atlanta room would not have recognized. By 1986, the family operation, run by the grandson of the original investor, was the largest bottler of the drink in the United States. It accounted for something like 15 in every 100 soft drink sales the company made in the country. The purchase went through that summer. It was the first move in a much larger consolidation. That consolidation produced a separate bottling corporation, floated on the market later the same year in an offering valued at about $1.5 billion. The price paid to the family has been reported at $1.4 billion in the financial press, and at $1.2 billion in the family's home city. That discrepancy has never been cleanly resolved in public, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Either figure lands somewhere near $4 billion in current money. Now the arithmetic, which I worked twice because the shape of it seems wrong. The consideration named in the original contract was $1. In 1899, that dollar bought roughly what $40 buys now. It was not a symbolic sum invented by lawyers. It was a real, small, ordinary amount of money, the price of a decent meal. Against that, the recorded cost of undoing the arrangement runs to $35 million in 1974, then somewhere between $1.2 and $1.4 billion in 1986. Those two numbers leave out the 3 transactions in the 30s and 40s that were paid in stock. They leave out the litigation. They leave out 70 years of syrup sold at a price the company could not set. 87 years from the signature to the final purchase. There is a temptation to describe this as the worst deal in American business, and versions of that sentence appear in almost everything written about it. I would put it differently. Candler sold something that did not exist yet. In 1899, there was no bottling industry, no distribution network, no glass supply chain, no contour bottle, no reason to believe any of it would work. What the two lawyers bought was the right to invent all of that at their own expense and their own risk. They and the men they recruited did invent it. The company did not lose $1 billion in 1986. It paid, very late, for a network it had refused to build. The families who built it were paid twice. Once in margin, decade after decade, and once at the end in stock and in cash. And by the time the last check cleared in 1986, the largest house any of them had ever built had been gone for 26 years. Nobody moved in. A house of 34,000 square feet stood empty in Chattanooga from 1941. Not abandoned, not seized, not lost in a bankruptcy or tied up in a will nobody could untangle. Owned outright in good repair on 30 acres of ground in the middle of a city. Owned by a family with more money than almost anyone in the state. And nobody moved in. Elizabeth Lupton died that year. The house had been hers since her husband's death 8 years before. After that, it simply sat. Her son Carter was living a few yards away. He had built his own place on the family land in the late 1920s, a comfortable house rather than an enormous one. There was a grease bay in the garage because he liked working on cars and preferred driving modest ones. He inherited the bottling interests and ran them for more than 40 years. By the time he died in 1977, his estate was reportedly the largest ever probated in the South, larger even than the estate of Howard Hughes. That claim comes from a local history, and I would not put it in a manuscript without the word reportedly attached. What is not in dispute is simpler. The man who owned the largest house in the region lived beside it in a smaller one, and left it empty for 19 years. There had been children in it briefly. A young relative left orphaned was taken in by the Luptons and lived in the big house before the family built the smaller one nearby. She went to school in the city, married a man who ran the bottling operation down in Savannah, and lived until 2006. She would have remembered the rooms better than anyone alive, and nobody appears to have asked her. Carter Lupton was known in Chattanooga as a recluse. That is the closest thing to an explanation anyone has offered, and it does not really explain anything. And I still cannot answer why nobody moved in. There was no shortage of Luptons. There was no shortage of money for staff or heating or roofing. The most likely reading is the dullest one. A house built for the scale of entertaining that existed in 1910 was simply useless by 1941. A family clever enough to have built it was clever enough to see that. In 1960, Carter Lupton went to a cousin who worked in property development, and the two of them agreed on what to do with it. They would take it down and put 15 one-acre lots on the ground. The demolition was not straightforward. The exterior walls were 18 inches thick, and the crews found them harder to break than expected. That is the sort of detail that tells you more about a building than a floor plan does. Furniture went out to relatives and to a cottage on the estate before the machines arrived. Some of it is still in Chattanooga houses. Rattan porch chairs, a dresser, some china, sitting in rooms belonging to people only distantly connected to any of this. 15 new houses went up on the ground where one had been. They are still there. It is a good neighborhood. Nothing about it announces what it used to be. The same erasure happened in Atlanta, on a longer timescale and with less deliberation. Whitehead had bought the family a house on Peachtree Street in 1903, at number 583, once the business could finally support one. That stretch of Peachtree was a row of large residences at the time. Almost none of them survive. The mansions went one at a time across the middle of the last century as the commercial district pushed north. One Victorian house at number 537 is among the last of the row still standing, on ground that developers have wanted for decades. What became of number 583 specifically I could not establish. And in Chattanooga, the address where the entire industry began, 17 Market Street, is not a building at all, it is a small city park. So the tally reads as follows. The first plant is a park. The largest house is a subdivision. The Atlanta house is unaccounted for on a street that has been almost entirely rebuilt. Of everything in this documentary that was raised with money from that contract, the buildings that survive are the ones the families gave away. That turns out not to be a coincidence. The money outlived the houses. An aquarium, a surgical pavilion, an art museum, a church, a women's dormitory, a public library. That is the list of building types this fortune produced in its second century, and it is worth setting it beside the first list. A 34,000 square foot house with a pipe organ, a Georgian estate on a planned suburb road, a neo-classical house on a Virginia hill, 8 Corinthian columns over a river. Same money, different buildings. The change happened deliberately, and it happened in wills. The nephew in Chattanooga went first. In 1944, he set up a charitable trust and named it after his uncle's old summer place on Lookout Mountain, a house called Benwood. Almost his entire fortune went into it when he died. That trust is the reason the limestone house above the river became a museum rather than an office building. The son next door to the empty house set up his own foundation in 1938. It was the first private foundation established in Tennessee. 40 years later, his family renamed it after the house that no longer existed. That is how a demolished mansion ended up as the name on grant letters across a city. What that foundation did with the money is the part that surprises people who know Chattanooga only from the last 30 years. In 1992, the city opened a freshwater aquarium of 400,000 gallons on the riverfront, the largest of its kind in the world at the time. $10 million came from the foundation. 11 million more came from One Air personally. It has drawn well over 20 million visitors since, and it is generally credited with turning a declining industrial river town into somewhere people choose to go. A grandson of a man who lent 2 lawyers money in 1899 paid for that. In Atlanta, the pattern is the same, and the scale is larger. The elder Whitehead son left a will that created a foundation in memory of the father he had barely known. It was directed at the relief of poverty and suffering, with children named as the priority. The younger son died 5 years later, and his will created a foundation named for their mother. She then created one of her own. 3 foundations from 3 members of one family, all of them funded by the same territory that Joseph Whitehead had gone to Atlanta to develop in 1900. The entire family fortune ended up in charitable hands, and none of it went to a descendant, because after 1940, there were none. One of those foundations has awarded close to $1 billion in grants since it began operating in 1946. Most of that went out in small amounts to women in 9 southern states. Another paid for a surgical pavilion at an Atlanta hospital, and a memorial room inside it. Portraits of all 4 members of the family hang on its walls. 3 of them were already dead when it was built. The Virginia house followed the same route. When the widow died in 1953, her estate went to her foundation. In 1961, that foundation gave Malvern Hall to the Episcopal Church in the village below it. It changed hands more than once afterwards, stood empty for a while, and was bought in 1995 by a couple who restored it properly, in kind, over years. It is a private home again, and it is in excellent condition. The Charlotte house became student housing. The Greenville plant became a library and a museum. The house on the bluff has a modern wing and a gift shop and a walking bridge. When I look at what stands and what does not, the sorting is almost perfectly clean. Every building in this story that was kept as a private house is gone or unaccounted for. Every building that was handed to somebody else is still here. Which brings us back to the street. Drive through the older parts of Chattanooga, or Charlotte, or Greenville, and the wide porches and the deep lawns are still there. Some of them were built by men who got a letter from a stranger in 1901 offering them a town. The iron gates have outlived the families. The paper that started it ran to about 600 words and cost $1. The man who signed it was certain he had got the better of the deal.